for the invitation today. It's a topic that's very, very dear to me as this one, so it's a pleasure to be able to talk about it. So the first thing I want to say is a big thank you really to everybody that's been involved in the work that I'm going to talk about today. I really want to thank somebody called Vic Noland, who's here holding her baby in the middle of the slide. So she's led on a lot of this work, and she was my absolutely fantastic postdoctoral research fellow through a lot of this work. And you know, her name will crop up a lot throughout the slides. She's now at Newcastle as an independent principal investigator of her own, and so watch out for further research in this field from her as well. Okay, so sleep then is a universal state of perceptual disengagement from our environments, and pretty much all species on the planet do it in some way or another. And the benefits of this seemingly unresponsive state we now know are incredibly vast, not least for our mental and our physical health, but also for our cognitive abilities. And of particular interest here today, our ability to make, create and store new memories. And of my focus here, our ability to create and store new memories of language. So sleep can be measured in lots of different ways, from subjective reports, so simply asking children and their parents about the quantity and quality of their sleep, to more objective type measures such as actigraphy watches like this, Fitbit type devices, to devices that are placed under the mattress that give you more of an objective measure of how much a child and how well a child has slept, to even more kind of high-tech ways of monitoring sleep, sometimes in laboratories, sometimes in hospitals, and we do this in children's homes through using EEG. An EEG tells you about the kind of brain oscillations that happen during sleep. So they give you a really kind of detailed perspective on exactly what's happening in the brain during sleep at a kind of microstructural level. So if you use EEG to capture sleep, then you'll see that sleep is comprised of lots of different brain stages. So at stage 1 sleep, you'll see relatively higher frequency brain oscillations that begin to slow a little bit more in stage 2, and where we see what are called sleep spindles. And these are short bursts of activity that signal that you're in this sleep stage. And then stage 3 is often referred to as deep sleep or slow wave sleep. And that's where we see this really large oscillation activity. And these stages collectively are referred to as non-rapid eye movement sleep. And they contrast starkly with rapid eye movement sleep, or REM, which is where you'll know we do most of our dreaming. And it's often referred to as paradoxical sleep, because actually the brain looks like it's almost awake, the frequencies increase again, but the body is in paralysis typically. So we cycle through these stages numerous times a night, or the average adult, the average child would. So this is just a picture of what a whole night would look like. So we progressively go through these stages of stage 1, 2, 3, and then REM sleep numerous times a night. But Il-sung Na's A Book of Sleep, I think, is a really beautiful reminder that we all sleep very differently. And there is substantial variability really in our sleeping habits, our sleeping architecture, and also our subjective experiences of sleep. And my research then has kind of in part been focused on trying to understand whether this variability in sleep that occurs over development, and also that occurs in neurodevelopmental disorders like developmental language disorder, has an influence at all over how language might develop. So this talk is in 3 parts today. The first part will consider mechanisms. How might sleep support language learning? What do we think is going on during sleep to support the creation of new memories for language? The second part will consider evidence for whether variation in sleep trajectories over development predict variation in language development. And then finally, we'll come on to whether sleep difficulties might play a role in developmental language disorder. Right then, so to the first question, how does sleep support language learning? So you can think of sleep, a language as just one example of memory making. And numerous research studies have shown us that if you learn something new and then you go to sleep, when you wake up and you test it again, your memory for that new material is likely to have improved or changed or become more robust and flexible. Perhaps you can use that information in a different context, in a generalized manner. And these memory changes that we know occur over sleep are referred to as memory consolidation. So the state of a new memory becoming more robust and more resilient after a period of sleep. And one account of why this happens during sleep is as follows. So it's argued that we've got this really short-term, fast-learning hippocampal system in the middle of our brains that sets up new memories for new events in quite a sparse manner. And then we've got this slower learning neocortical system, which is our, you can think of this as our kind of long-term memory store. And over a longer period of time, hippocampal memories fade and these long-term memories become stronger. And that creates our kind of our long-term memory system. But where does sleep come in then? Well, there are three crucial events that happen during NREM sleep that are proposed to support the replay of new memories and their strengthening and consolidation in neocortical systems. So these are hippocampal ripples, and these are argued to kind of represent replays of new memories that occur over and over again during sleep. And these hippocampal ripples are temporally nested within these sleep spindles that I mentioned earlier. And these are also temporally synchronized with these real big slow oscillations that you show during slow wave sleep that arise from the neocortex. And you don't need to understand the intricacies of this really, but together these events are proposed to support this memory strengthening that happens during sleep. You can think of sleep spindles as almost like a shuttle bus, getting short-term memories to long-term memory sites. Okay. So to test this idea in the context of children's word learning, we first carried out a study actually in boarding schools with children aged 8 to 12 years. This was a few years ago now, but this is where we trained children on novel words like dolpheg, just made up words, and they learn these words either in the morning or later in the evening, and then their memory for these novel words was tested immediately after training and then 12 and 24 hours later. And we trained them simply by asking them to repeat the words aloud and monitor them for particular phonemes and segment them. And we found that before sleep, new words can be recalled and recognized to a certain extent. But after sleep, recall and recognition improved dramatically. So this graph shows you recall performance on these new words, and children were asked which new words began with golf, just as an example. So immediately after they were trained in blue, whether or not they were trained in the morning or the evening, they were quite similar. But for the children who were trained in the evening, here on the right-hand side, when they were tested 12 hours later, their performance dramatically improved. Whereas for the group tested and trained in the morning and then tested at the end of a day of wake, they didn't change. So this suggests that sleep is playing an important role in supporting our ability to learn and retain new words in children. And another key thing we noticed when we carried out these studies were that these overnight increases in memory were much bigger for children than they had been previously in adults. And I'm not going to go into this in much depth, but we found that one key reason for this is that children spend roughly double the amount of time in this slow wave sleep compared to adults. And we know this is where the memory making magic happens, and where spindles and slow waves are in abundance. So this might account for one reason why we see these bigger effects in children relative to adults. Emma James is my PhD student who's looked into this in quite a lot of detail. So she's somebody to look up if you want to know more about these developmental differences in sleep. And we also went on to show that this pattern of sleep-dependent word learning is similar when children learn real words with meaning, when they learn words from storybooks read to them by their parents, so in more naturalistic contexts. And another example of a study that reported benefits of sleep in word learning for younger children was by Sophie Williams and Jessica Horst in 2014. So they also read stories to 3-year-olds and then embedded novel words either in the same story 3 times or 3 different stories. And they found that children who napped versus children that remained awake were, when they were tested 2.5 hours later after their nap, they recalled significantly more words from these stories than children who stayed awake. So then we went on to show that the extent to which sleep can support memory depends on at least 2 key variables that are kind of intrinsic to the child. So the first one is vocabulary knowledge. So we found that children who come to the task of word learning with better vocabulary knowledge tend to show bigger benefits of sleep. And this might provide us with one kind of mechanistic explanation for why we see these Matthew effects in word learning. So why the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So children who start out with better vocabulary knowledge tend to accumulate more vocabulary knowledge faster. So the idea that your existing knowledge might support subsequent consolidation during sleep provides one example for why that might be. And the second factor was that the quality and quantity of these NREM features, like the amount of sleep spindles that children show, the quality of these sleep spindles, and the amount of slow oscillation activity they show, these children also show bigger effects of sleep. So we went on to kind of propose that children who are rich on both of these dimensions, so children with better language abilities and children with better quality spindles and slow waves, should be at an advantage in word learning. And this, of course, has implications for children with developmental disorders who have weaknesses in both of these dimensions. And our previous research is particularly focused on children with dyslexia and children with autism spectrum disorder. And because the focus of today is on language and developmental language disorder, I'm not going to go into these kind of studies in much depth, but just in a nutshell, what we found is that children with dyslexia who do not show strong evidence of sleep difficulties, but they tend to come to the task of word learning with much weaker encoding, much weaker vocabulary knowledge and language skills in general, their long-term memories tend to be less resilient as a consequence of this early difficulty in the time course of learning when they're first faced with these novel words. Whereas children with autism, they tend to have difficulties with the precise aspects of sleep that we know are important for memory consolidation. So they tend to show shorter duration sleep spindles, less time in NREM sleep, and also less slow wave activity. And these aspects of sleep seem to be directly predictive of just how much they will consolidate, how much they'll retain in terms of new language over time. And we've also found evidence of extrinsic factors that can influence how much sleep can support memory making of new language in children. And by extrinsic factors, I mean kind of factors that are outside the child. So features of training that might influence how well sleep can support new memory. And one of these variables is the time between learning and sleep. So in 3 papers now, we've shown that children are more likely to remember new words in the long term if they learn closer to sleep. So if less time elapses between when they learn and then when they go to bed. So arguably this might be because there's less interference then from other information that they're encountering during the day. And these benefits of learning closer to sleep have been consistently stronger for children with weaker vocabulary knowledge. So children with poor vocabulary knowledge, in other words, might benefit particularly from refreshing the new information that they've learned before bed. We've also looked into whether bedtime stories might be a useful medium for children with weaker vocabulary to learn new vocabulary and have a better chance at being able to retain it in the longer term. Okay, so I've presented you with a bit of a whistle-stop tour of kind of what we know about the mechanisms by which sleep might support language learning, as well as some of the conditions that might bolster these effects. So better vocabulary, better sleep quality, and also timing learning, so it's optimal for sleep consolidation. But I think all of these studies to date that I've talked to you about are very much kind of lab-based style studies. They're not really studies that have been carried out in kind of more real-world contexts. So they tell us the whys and the mechanisms, but what we really want to know and what we really want to gather is closer to real-world evidence that actual variation in sleep in development is predicting actual variation in language development. So that's what I'm going to come on to now. So when we began looking into this question, we found that there was some largely cross-sectional data already in existence that suggested that sleep is playing a role in language development. So for example, a study by Lam et al. In 2011 used actigraphy and Fitbit style watches, as well as a sleep diary for 7 days in children aged 3 to 5 years old. And they found that vocabulary and auditory attention span were positively correlated with nighttime sleep duration. And interesting also was that these variables were negatively correlated with daytime sleep duration, suggesting that daytime naps were not a good thing in this group of children. And then in older children, Buchelt et al. Found that longer time spent asleep and also better quality sleep were related to intellectual abilities in the form of an IQ test and also academic performance. And this was both at 8 years and 2 years later. So particularly that first study highlighted to us that the development of good quality sleep patterns might have a measurable influence over language development. And one variable that was of particular interest to us here was this shift from polyphasic sleep that happens around up to around 18 months. So where frequent napping it takes place during the day, to this shift to more monophasic type sleep, as children are gradually able to drop their naps and sleep through the night. So most children achieve this monophasic pattern of sleeping round about kind of 4 years of age at a maximum, at least in cultures where daytime napping is not the norm. But the age at which children do not drop their naps varies considerably, as does total sleep time over 24-hour periods. And we were wondering whether this dropping of naps might provide a signature of healthy brain development and thereby successful language development. So in a study led by Vic Noland, we wanted to address whether dropping the nap and sleeping during the night is longitudinally predictive of vocabulary at school entry. And to do this, we analysed data from the Born in Bradford cohort study. So we drew on 354 children or infants who were aged between 6 and 36 months old. And as expected, we found that their total sleep time just decreased from 6 to 36 months. So this is the figure on the left-hand side, as you'd completely expect. And this ratio of nighttime to daytime sleep increased over this same period. So that means that as infants were gradually dropping their daytime sleep, the ratio of their nighttime to daytime sleep was getting longer. So all good so far. But of most interest in this study, we found that the mean difference between nighttime and daytime sleep was predictive of vocabulary at school entry. So with more nighttime to daytime sleep, predicting better language as these guys were going to school. So what might explain this then? So it might be that sleep is just simply a marker of brain maturation, accounting for this association. So as sleep patterns are developing, so is the brain, so is language. Or it might be that sleep is a driving mechanism of language learning, as I've already outlined, that sleep is actively shaping language growth. But either way, nevertheless, this is allowing us to start accumulating evidence to show that sleep is important for this aspect of development. Another thing of note in this study that I found really interesting, and I'd love the opportunity to follow up, is this exploratory analysis that we did, which suggested that socioeconomic status was also predictive of vocabulary outcomes, as you might expect. So children from richer socioeconomic home backgrounds were more likely to have better vocabulary, Although notably this association wasn't as strong as the association between sleep and language. But of most interest here, sleep patterns partially mediated this relationship between the socioeconomic environment and vocabulary knowledge. So this suggests that good sleep might protect the effect of an adverse home environment on vocabulary development. So if you're from a low socioeconomic environment, but you have good sleep, then your vocabulary knowledge might be relatively protected. And this in turn suggests that sleep hygiene interventions might be particularly beneficial for children of low socioeconomic status. Right, so despite this accumulating evidence that sleep and language development are associated with each other, there still seems to be a real knowledge gap, I think, amongst parents and early years foundation stage practitioners. So we carried out a survey of 577 parents and 297 EYFS practitioners, and this was led by Amy Atkinson, who's a sleep and development researcher from Lancaster. And here we found that 90% agreed that sleep was important for health, mood and behaviour, but less than 40% agreed that sleep was important for language development. And this isn't surprising. I mean, the literature on sleep and language development is far more in its infancy than it is for health, mood and behaviour. But nevertheless flags up that there is a knowledge gap here that we would like to address. And in this survey, it was also flagged up that there was a consensus within the practitioners that there was a lack of policy on early years sleep in early years settings. So there isn't, for instance, a need to have a policy on when and for how long, the conditions under which nursery children should nap, for example. Okay, so to address some of these gaps, myself, Amy Atkinson, Michelle St. Clair, who's here today, and Gareth Gaskell, and also the CEO of the sleep charity, Vicky Dawson. We've recently been awarded a ESRC secondary data analysis grant to examine the stability and predictive value of early sleep characteristics from birth through to childhood and adolescence, and whether parent-reported measures of sleep quantity and quality will allow us to build models of the predictive role of early sleep for different aspects of development, so including language, education and mental health. And I think looking at these things in interaction are really important. So at the moment we have the literature on sleep and language, we've got literature on sleep and mental health, but these are rarely considered together. And we think there are really important interactions between language and mental health, which might be partly moderated by sleep. So it'll give us an opportunity to look at these things together. So we'll be drawing on big data sets from Born in Bradford and the ALSPEC cohort studies to address these questions. And then I think probably even more exciting for me is the opportunity to do some more translational work here as well. So we're going to work with Vicky Dawson to run workshops, one of which is planned at the House of Commons, to try and build up awareness of the important role of early sleep. We'll be working with Vicky and to target the Department for Education to recommend modifications for the early years foundation stage statutory framework, and campaigning to add guidance to the Red Book that all new parents receive, to add information in there on sleep. So yeah, I'd love to come back and talk to you about this in a couple of years from now. Okay, so now on to the final section of the talk. So do sleep difficulties play a role in DLD? As well as there being a knowledge gap in the importance of sleep for language development, there also appears to be a gap in clinical practice, I think, surrounding the need for sleep support in children with language difficulties. So in another survey that we ran, this time with 116 UK paediatric clinicians led by Vic, we asked these speech language therapists and so on whether sleep is something that parents or teachers of children with language difficulties bring up. And 89% said yes. And we tried to ascertain that this wasn't just driven by children with autism. This was children who had speech and language difficulties, not in the context just of autism. And this again suggested to us that sleep difficulties are something that are presenting alongside language difficulties in the clinic, as well as being reported by parents. So there is very little research on sleep in DLD, which Nikki will be very aware of as well. But I think the most highly cited and important piece of work to date was led by Nikki Botting. This was a study of 65 3 to 18-year-old children with language disorders. It was a parent report-based study, and they found that children with language disorders were more likely to have longer sleep onset latency than typical peers. They were more likely to wake up early in the morning, and their sleep onset latency, so basically the amount of time they took to get to sleep on an evening, was found to correlate with both syntax and structural aspects of language, and also semantic pragmatic abilities on the children's communication checklist. So this study lends really useful information to what parents are reporting on their children with language disorder sleep patterns, but it's limited by the extent it's only reporting on subjective sleep, and what we're really lacking in the literature is objective measurement of sleep to complement this really rich subjective data. So, as I mentioned earlier, subjective sleep tells you about perceptual experiences of sleep, but it doesn't tell you exactly how long children are sleeping or how many times they're waking up on a night more objectively. So by objective measures, I mean the EEG and actigraphy. And there's one other study I just want to flag up before I tell you about our final piece of work. And this is a study by Earl, Landy and Myers, who trained adults on a word learning task. So this is adults with and without language disorders. And this study lends some support to the idea that sleep consolidation processes might be different or might be hampered in some way in individuals with language disorder. So they trained them on some new words. They tested them immediately after training and then again the next day. And they found that the adults with and without language disorder didn't differ during training, and they didn't differ at the immediate test. But they did differ after a period of sleep the next day. So they showed smaller consolidation effects, whereas you can see the controls showed these improvements in performance after sleep. The individuals with language difficulties did not. So it was argued here that sleep might not promote the consolidation of new language in the same way. But it should be highlighted, I think, that other studies do report more mixed findings. So with children, it seems to be problems at the point of training that are more likely to characterise word learning difficulties in children with language disorders, which you would very much expect. And where consolidation difficulties have been reported in children, they tend to be only for particular aspects of language and not others. So the literature is definitely a bit mixed. But I just wanted to highlight that there is at least some evidence that sleep consolidation may be an issue in language disorder. Right, so in this final study, just a couple more minutes, I want to tell you about we examined sleep behaviour in children with language disorder using both subjective report from parents and also on a subset of the sample went on to use objective actigraphy to measure sleep. And this was again led by Vic. I told you she'd feature a lot. So in this study, we also planned a third study where we looked at word learning in these children, but that was scuppered by the pandemic, unfortunately. But nevertheless, we've got the sleep data that I can tell you about. So in study 1, we gathered parent report data from 196 parents of children aged 4 to 6 years old, and 61 of these children had language disorders. And we found that children who scored more highly on the parent report language measures also show better sleep-related behaviours. So, for example, things like lower bedtime anxiety, night wakings, parasomnias. What was really interesting and somewhat surprising to us, though, was that sleep duration was actually higher in children with language difficulties. Now, longer sleep duration is often seen as a good thing in development. Particularly as children get into adolescence, I would say, where sleep duration can be hampered by poor sleep hygiene. There's less consistency in literature at this age that longer sleep duration is a good thing. But nevertheless, we were pretty surprised that children with language disorder were actually sleeping longer, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We also found that language status, so whether or not a child had a language disorder, was associated with sleep, even when controlling for things like age, gender, tension, and also social skills as a proxy for autism spectrum disorder, where we know there is a high prevalence of sleep difficulties. So it's important to control for that here, because we don't want the group difference just to be skewed by a higher comorbidity with autism in the language group. And I've lost my mouse, there it is. And then in study 2, we went on to invite a subsample of the children from study 1 to complete an objective measurement of sleep. And that was a week's worth of actigraphy data. So we asked them to wear a watch as they were sleeping for a week. And that allowed us to measure things like sleep duration, sleep efficiency, and sleep onset latency much more objectively. The graph on the left here shows you sleep duration, and in the pinky red colour you can see children with typically developing children without language difficulties, and the browny red colour are children with language difficulties. And just as we found in the first study, using parent report, we again found that language disordered children slept for longer, and they also slept more efficiently than their language typical peers. So what do we have here then? So parents are reporting sleep difficulties in their language disordered children. And they're also reporting longer sleep duration, which, as I said, is usually a good thing. So excessively long sleep duration can, of course, be a bad sign, but the levels here were not excessively long. And parents also reported a history of sleep difficulties, I should have said. So children with language disorders were more likely to be terrible sleepers as infants. And then the objective data corroborated the parent report of longer sleep duration, but also suggested they had more efficient sleep too. So how can we account for all this then? So one possibility is that early sleep difficulties perhaps lead parents to be more vigilant about ensuring their children get enough sleep. Another possibility is that these children are at a delayed state of brain maturation, and we know that sleep duration decreases over development. So the fact that these children are sleeping a little bit longer might just suggest that they're slightly developmentally delayed more globally. Another possibility is that actigraphy was not picking up the bedtime anxiety, parasomnias, etc., that parents were reporting in the questionnaires. But I think anyhow, this all suggests that early sleep difficulties are present in developmental language disorders, and that subjective and objective measures should be used alongside each other and be thought of as complementary. But I think what we really need here is objective, subjective, longitudinal data to track the development of sleep patterns alongside the development of language and other mental health type markers to look at how these things develop over age. Okay. So final thoughts then. So we've shown that in our lab, in Sleep, Language and Memory lab at the University of York here, that sleep plays a role in supporting language learning over the lifespan, and we're gathering further information on what the underlying mechanisms might be to support that relationship. We're also seeing in closer to real world evidence that developmental trajectories of sleep do predict development of language. But at the moment, this is really limited. It's limited to parent report data, and we're really lacking knowledge still of how exactly sleep predicts language, education, mental health development into childhood and adolescence. And hopefully this is something that the new project can speak to. There is some evidence that sleep difficulties characterise children with developmental language disorder, and that parent perceptions of poor sleep in these children from an early age do seem to persist into childhood. And this corroborates reports that we've seen from professionals, practitioners, but there is so much more to be done in this field. So I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts, what you think about all this, and what aspects you think might be really worth pursuing. So yeah, looking forward to talking to you all about it. But that just leaves me to say thank you very, very much for coming along and listening. And yeah, I'm very happy to take any questions and comments that you might have.